This is the lecture on Aquinas and his views with respect to the relationship between faith and reason. We'll be looking at a couple of texts, the Summa Conscientialis, Book 1, chapters 1 through 8, for his discussion of what we can know by faith and what we can know by reason, and then his famous 5 ways or 5 proofs for the existence of God, which are found in the Summa Theologica, Part 1, Question 2, Article 3. So Aquinas starts out in the Summa Conscientialis with the discussion of the end or the purpose of human life. Remember our natural law discussion? This will sound a little bit familiar, but the idea here is that everything aims for some good. The entire universe is ordered towards some good end. And with human beings in particular, we're able to reason about the good. Sometimes we can be mistaken. But when we are correct in our understanding of the good, we move towards, or our life should be directed towards the good which fits that part of us which is most distinctive. And of course, for Aquinas, that is intellect. He follows Aristotle and many other philosophers there, that the distinctive feature of the human being is reason. And so the end or purpose of human life is one which has especially to do with the reason or intellect. So he explains here in the Summa Conscientialis that the good of intellect is truth. Right? What is it that reason or intellect is most after? Truth, understanding. And of course, for Aquinas, God is truth, and so this fits in with what he says elsewhere, where he says the purpose of human life is to understand God. And since this is the goal of human life, it is a goal which we aim at through all of our activities. And in particular here, he is talking about the relationship between faith and reason, so religion and philosophy. And he says truth is the goal of both faith, or Christianity for him, and philosophy. In particular here, he's talking about metaphysics, or first philosophy. So he says, this is what we are supposed to do as human beings. Pursue the truth. Aim for wisdom. And he goes on in the next chapter of Book 1 of the Summa Conscientialis to kind of make the argument that not only is this a goal which is the goal of all human life, but it's actually a goal which we should be happy to fulfill. So he says here that among all human pursuits, the pursuit of wisdom is the most perfect, the most sublime, the most profitable, and the most delightful. And he makes an argument for each of those, right? So he says it's the most perfect because it allows us to participate in true beatitude. It allows us to reach the most perfect state of human abilities. The most sublime, because it helps us to approach a likeness and friendship with God, who is wise, who is wisdom, who is truth, according to Aquinas. And so it brings us into a special relationship with God. Most profitable, or some translations say the most useful, because it is through wisdom that we arrive at the kingdom of immortality. So it is by achieving wisdom that we put ourselves in a place to understand God when the time comes, when we have access to God more completely after death. And the most delightful, or joyful, some translations say, because truth is one of the few things, perhaps the only thing, which is totally free from tediousness and bitterness. This might sound a bit familiar, because it's very close to what we saw in Aristotle, who said that the life of contemplation, right, was also the most delightful, the best sort of life, the most enjoyable. And Aquinas is saying something similar here, that to pursue the truth, to contemplate God, is something which we as human beings ought to feel most fit to do. So the next question he addresses is, if it's the case that our goal is truth. How do we actually go about achieving that knowledge, right? How do we actually learn? And he says that we can seek certitude in each thing as the nature of that thing allows. So we seek the truth about things in the way that's best for those things, right? Some things are most properly known or easiest to know through scientific investigation, for example. Some things are best examined through philosophical investigation. Some things are best examined through belief and faith, according to Aquinas. So Aquinas says that there are two main ways in which human beings can come to know truth, and especially can come to know truth about God. The first way is the one most closely associated with philosophy, and that is through natural human reason. Most things about the world, and even some things about God, we can know through reason, that is, through philosophy. For example, he says, humans can know, right, various scientific facts about the world through reason, science. We can know that human beings are rational animals, just like Aristotle taught us, through rational investigation. We can even know some things about God. In particular, Aquinas argues, we can know that God exists, and we can know that God is one, that God is simple, that God is pure act through reason alone. And we'll see that in a little bit here when we talk about the 5 proofs that Aquinas gives for the existence of God. He thinks that we can know these things through pure philosophy, absolutely no need to say anything theological in order to know that God exists, for example. However, there are some things, and especially things about God, which we cannot know through reason, things which philosophy does not have access to, according to Aquinas. And those things are only knowable by us through revelation. What Aquinas means here is that there are some things which we must take on faith, which we can only know because God has revealed them to us in the Bible, according to Aquinas. Key examples here are things like that God is triune, that Jesus is God. He says, try as we might, we would never be able to reason to that information. There is no way to know that through reason. We just have to accept it on faith because it's given to us in revelation. So although we can prove philosophically that God exists, we can't really know details about who or what he is. Details like that the Trinity is an accurate representation of God. Interestingly, one of the things he thinks that philosophy cannot prove, which some other philosophers, for example, Aristotle, argued for philosophically, or argued about philosophically, is the idea that the world is created. Of course, we see in the Bible claim that God created the world from nothing. However, Aquinas says, when we look at philosophical investigations, most notably for him Aristotle, we see that philosophers prove or attempt to prove that the world is actually eternal, not created. So he says this is one of the things where you seem to have discord between philosophy and theology, or between reason and faith. And when you end up in those situations, according to Aquinas, you have to accept what's given in Revelation and assume that philosophers are either making errors or that, in fact, that is just not something that is accessible to us through reason alone. So, since there are some things which are only accessible to us through revelation, Aquinas goes on to talk about the value of belief. Although most philosophers, and even Aquinas himself, highly value knowledge and the idea that we should attempt to know as much as we possibly can know, Aquinas recognizes that there are some things which we cannot know for certain, and so for those things it is proper to just believe them. And indeed, he says, even those things which we can know through philosophy, it is appropriate for some folks to just believe those as well. That there are many reasons, and he lists a few here, why a person might not sort of go through the trouble of doing philosophy. He says it's very difficult for many people to have the time, the resources, the mental acuity to achieve philosophical understanding of some things, for example, that God exists. And so for those folks, he says it's acceptable to just have belief, to rely on revelation, even if they are technically capable of actually having knowledge about those. Another reason why the belief is sometimes acceptable, he says, even when we can discover the truth, it is a very laborious process, right? Philosophy is hard work. Takes a lot of time, it takes a lot of patience, and because it takes a lot of time, it takes a lot of resources. You've got to be in a kind of stable living situation, for example, where you have the time to practice philosophy. And so, not everyone has that time. Even the folks who do have that time, then they would be going most of their life without this important knowledge, according to Aquinas. So it is better to start with belief, perhaps, and then eventually, if you've got the time, to develop understanding later on. He also points out that people make mistakes. We make errors in our judgment and in our understanding frequently. And so if we only had philosophy to rely on, we might end up thinking that we know things which are false, right? So better to have both philosophy and faith, knowledge and belief, so that we can kind of cover all our bases. And so, like I said with the creation example, right, we might have an error where, we might have a place where many people, according to Aquinas, have fallen into error with respect to that in their attempts to gain knowledge. But because we have faith to rely on in the Bible, we can know that those are errors and sort of adjust accordingly. And so both knowledge and belief are important for Aquinas. This last little thing that I wanted to point out towards the end of this section of the Summa Contra Gentiles is this famous statement that truth cannot contradict truth. The truth of faith and the truth of reason are the same truth for Aquinas. He is getting this from the Muslim philosopher Averroes, who originally makes this statement in his discussion of the relationship between philosophy and the Quran. And Aquinas says, just like Averroes says, truth cannot contradict truth. Whatever is true in philosophy is true. Whatever is true in religion is true. And so they cannot contradict one another. They are just two ways of examining truth. So, one of the things, perhaps the most famous things that Aquinas does in this discussion of faith and reason, is making his claim that we can, in fact, prove philosophically that God exists. That the existence of God is not one of the things which we have to rely on revelation for, but in fact, we can know it through human reason or natural reason. So that is through philosophy. In the Summa Theologica, he offers us 5 philosophical proofs, which have come to be called his famous 5 ways that God exists. Proofs which rely not at all on scripture or belief, but instead are pure philosophical proofs. So we're going to take a quick look at those 5 proofs. So we're seeing an example of philosophy in practice, even with respect to a question which many people would consider to be theological in nature. So his first proof is often called the proof from motion. And essentially, it starts out with an examination of the world around us, as most of these proofs do. He says, we can see through our experience of the world that there is motion, things move, right? I'm moving right now. We can see through our examination of the stars that heavenly bodies are moving. All kinds of stuff indicates for us that there is motion. And so he says, whatever is in motion is either put in motion. Is put in motion by another. Motion is going from potentiality to actuality, and nothing can make this move from potentiality to actuality, except by the help of something which is already actualized, which is already in motion. Right? So my pen can't move unless I move it, something like that. Right? So it's impossible that there's both a mover, that a thing is both mover and moved. A thing cannot be in potentiality and actuality with respect to the same thing. So there must be what Aquinas calls a first mover. He is taking this proof largely from Aristotle. Aristotle has a famous argument for what he calls the first mover, or the prime mover, the unmoved mover, the thing which gets the ball rolling for the entire universe, and that's essentially what Aquinas is talking about here. There must be a first mover, which is not itself in motion, which moves everything else but is itself unmoved. And Aquinas says, well, this first mover, this thing which gets the ball rolling, that's just what everyone would call God. Since such a thing must exist, God must exist. His next proof, proof 2, we're going to call the proof from efficient cause. The idea here, it follows very closely the first argument from motion, that we can see from our experience that there are efficient causes. Things which cause other things, or create other things. So he says nothing can be an efficient cause of itself. Nothing can create itself. This is somewhat similar to Descartes' part of Descartes' argument from his own existence. So it must be the case that everything that is caused or created is caused or created by something else. But, like many philosophers, Aquinas says, well, we can't have an infinite regress of efficient causes. If we have this infinite regress, there's no way to explain how anything got started in the first place. And so he says there must be a first efficient cause, an uncaused cause. Just like there has to be a first mover, which is itself not moved, there must be a first creator, which is itself not created. A first efficient cause, which is not itself caused. Right? He says, well, this uncaused cause, that sort of first being is just what everyone would identify with God, since such a thing must exist. God must exist. So he thinks here again, he has proven just from starting with our experience of the world that God must exist. His third proof, the proof from possibility and necessity, starts with the claim that in nature we find that many things, most things, are possible. What he means by possible here, that they are generated and can become corrupted, that they can be or not be, that they don't have to exist. For example, I am a possible being. There was a time when I was not, now I am. In the future, I will not be again. I don't have to exist. So again, he's starting here from his experience of the world. We see all kinds of possible things which could be or not be. But he says we can reason to the idea that it's impossible that only possible things exist. It can't be the case that everything can be or not be. If that were the case, then there would have been a time in history when there was nothing, when all the possible things did not exist. And then, if that was the case, there would be nothing now. There would have been nothing to get anything else going, to create anything else. So it can't be the case that there are only possible things. There must be at least one necessary thing, something which cannot not be, something which always is, which must be, which will never not be, which has something which has continual existence. And he says, we might think of a few of those things which are necessary in order for something else to work, or which get their necessity from some other place, but just like with causality, we can't have an infinite regress of necessary beings, there must be at least one there must be one necessary thing. He thinks there's just one, which is necessary in itself, which has takes its necessity from itself and causes everything else. This first necessary being, this thing which always was, is now, and will be in the future, well, that is just part of our definition for God. If such a thing must exist, then God must exist. So, from this distinction between the possibility and necessity, from our experience of the possible and the necessary, we arrive at the understanding that God as necessary being must exist. Aquinas' fourth proof is the proof from gradation in things. He starts here again by observing the world, and he says that we see through our experience of the world that in nature things exist, or in the natural world, right? Things exist which are more or less good, more or less true, more or less noble. So we can kind of compare things in that way. This is better than that. But this concept of more or less, the idea that things exist on a gradient, he says, it has to be predicated on the assumption that there is some maximum. Something can't be better or worse unless there is a best. Right? So a thing can't be more or less good unless there is a good in itself, an ultimate good. A thing can't be more or less true unless there is an ultimate truth. So he says there must be a maximum in any genus, which is the cause of our ability to sort of grade things as better or worse along that axis. And he says, well, this again is just going to be part of our definition of God. When we think about God, we think of God as pure goodness, pure truth, pure being. These are called the transcendentals. Aquinas makes arguments for the idea that God is goodness itself, that God is being itself elsewhere. So he says, the fact that we have this way of approaching the world where we can compare things to one another and to this standard of goodness, truth, nobility, etc. being, means that there must exist a maximum, and that maximum is God. So if the maximum must exist, and we just associate that with God, then God must exist. And the final proof, the fifth proof, is Aquinas' proof from the governance of the world. You might notice that this proof is somewhat close to the more modern idea of intelligent design. There is some sort of designer or governor of the world. So that's the kind of idea that Aquinas is arguing for here as well. So he starts out, once again, as with all the four preceding proofs, with an observation of the world. And he says that we can see in the world that there are some things which have intelligence and can be self-directed, and there are some things which do not have intelligence and cannot be self-directed. For example, you've got a tree, which is not an intelligent being and is not self-directed, and you've got a human being, which is an intelligent being and is self-directed. He says, even though you have this difference in intelligence, everything that exists acts for some end, has a purpose or a goal. This is quite similar to what Aristotle says, that everything has a function. Right? The function of the tree is to grow to an appropriate height and to reproduce more trees. The function of the human being, the purpose of the human being, is to understand the truth, to know God. And he says, we can explain naturally, perhaps, how intelligent things are directed towards their end, because they can direct themselves. But we can't explain in the same way how the non-thinking things, trees, rocks, etc., can be directed towards their end, and yet they are. The rock always falls close to the ground if you release it from a height. It's always directed towards its appropriate place. The tree, unless it's diseased or something, always works towards being the best version of tree it can be, even though there's no intelligence there within itself to direct its actions. So he says there must be some intelligent being which exists and which directs these non-intelligent things towards their natural end. There must be something which is making sure that everything is functioning the way that it is supposed to function. Well, this intelligent director is just what we would call God. That seems to be part of the definition we have when we think about God. And so if such a thing must exist, God must exist. So we can see with all 5 of these proofs that Aquinas thinks he can start from some observation he has about the world and arrive at a proof that God must exist. He has made absolutely no reference to any sort of scripture or religious ideas here. He thinks he is working purely in philosophy, pure reason, and so the existence of God, he says, can be proven philosophically through natural reason. We don't need to rely on faith or scripture or anything like that to arrive at the knowledge that God exists, according to Aquinas, right? So he thinks this ought to be convincing to everyone. He, of course, thinks all of his proofs work. We might think that there might be flaws in some of them. But as a whole, Aquinas thinks this should be convincing, right? Any person who ought to be able to, if they are rational, if they have the ability to reason, to be able to sort of follow along with these proofs and arrive at the understanding that God exists, right? And so he says this is a kind of good starting place for us to see how reason can help us to understand even those things which at first might seem to be the purview of theology. We might think that the existence of God is a theological problem, right, not a rational or a philosophical problem. But in fact, Aquinas says, no, this is something that philosophy and reason can discuss. It's an appropriate avenue of philosophical investigation, and we can arrive at, he thinks, an answer, a correct answer, using a philosophy alone. Of course, there are other philosophers who disagree with how the relationship between faith and reason should operate. But this is where we're going to stop here with Aquinas' view that there are some things which philosophy cannot do. Philosophy has limitations, which he thinks theology, faith, religion does not have. But there is perhaps more available to philosophy than a person might initially expect.